Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Veeam 100 show. My name is Safia Mohammed, and I'm a community analyst here at Veeam Software. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Kirsten Stoner, technologist on the Veeam product strategy team, as well as our guest, Jim Jones, Veeam Vanguard and Senior Product Infrastructure Architect at 1111 Systems. I am joining you from Kansas today. Kirsten's joining from Columbus and Jim is joining from the state of West Virginia. We have production coming out of the state of Texas as well as Ohio. Please be sure to let us know where you're joining us from. We would love to shout you out later in the comments. How are you both doing today, Kirsten, Jim, on this lovely Thursday?
Well, for me, I would say it started a little bit chaotic, you know what I mean? But we're here now and we're ready to, talk about Jim's project that he's been working on and how he's been helping his customers and other tech community members make sure they're, keeping their data safe.
Yeah, doing well here as well, Sophia, trying to stay warm, I'm sure as all of us here in the Midwestern type area are, and looking forward to today's event.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you to our global audience for joining us today. If you have not tuned into a Veeam 100 show, this is our 13th Veeam 100 show, and this is a monthly show that we do the first Thursday of every month. And it's a chance for us to introduce our Veeam 100 members to you all. These are Veeam's top technical evangelists from our Veeam community, our vanguards, our legends, our Veeam MVPs. They want to showcase a project that they're working on and they're passionate about sharing with the wider Veeam community. And we're here to do that today with Jim and Kirsten. But before we get into that, we need to know, who are Jim and Kirsten? If you probably know Kirsten, she's on the shows all the time. But Jim, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience that may have not seen you before?
Yeah, so thank you, Sophia. So yeah, I'm Jim Jones. It's a long title, but R&D nerd at 1111 Systems is what it boils down to. Working our product team to bring new solutions out to our customers that are around cloud and data protection in lots of different ways. You can find me pretty much in terms of blogging on Kool-Aid.info and Kool-Aid.it anywhere that's social.
Nice. And Kirsten, would you like to introduce yourself if anybody hasn't tuned in to a Thursday Tech Bite and might have not seen you before?
Yeah, for sure. I'm Kirsten Stoner, a technologist at Veeam Software. I've been at Veeam now for about 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years. And I've worked actually with the Veeam community since my beginnings here when I started. So I've known Jim. He's been part of our community program now for like, how long now has it been, Jim? 10 years? 8 years. So it's like we grew up together,
Yeah. That was actually going to be one of my questions. I'm like, what was the program like back then? And what was Jim like back then? You've known him for over a decade. So
Jim was
changed.
He was just a young lad. He was just a young guy back then, like us all. No, but yeah, the community program back then was a bit smaller, a bit more condensed. And as Veeam's grown, and so has its product feature set, so has the community, because different tech enthusiasts have different interests in different products, whether it may be maybe they're more interested in virtualization, or maybe they are really specialized in Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365. So it's been a great journey to see how the community has added all these different people from these different specializations and then learning from them as well. So it's very much evolved into something a lot greater than I guess I would have even expected, 10 years ago. And I'm really happy that I can still be a part of the community and, interact with all of its members.
Yeah, absolutely. So I owe quite a bit to this community. Yes, what was it like back then? Back then, I was effectively an SMB sysadmin working for a state government organization, and we started using Veeam in 2011 because we didn't want tape and we needed to test backups. And along the way, got into this community, and as Veeam has grown, this community has grown, so has frankly my career, and I've made it to the place where I work for what today is Veeam's biggest partner in the world, doing all the fun nerdy things that we all kind of dream about doing back then. So it's great.
Yeah, it's been amazing to see. And this year at Summit, we actually celebrated those who have been in the program for 10 years now, and it's a big group that has still stayed involved. So hopefully that counts for something for what the community has done for people and what they feel about the community, the friends they've made along the way.
Absolutely.
But we're here to talk about Jim's project, so definitely want to delve into that. Jim, you have a project on enhancing your disaster recovery strategy, disaster recovery plan with object storage, and you have a big presentation to share with us, so I don't want to take any more time away from that. So I want to give it back to you and Kirsten to discuss the disaster recovery plan with object storage. Let's get into it.
Yeah. So I will hesitate to say that it's a big project. It's more of a let's voice and look at how we think about disaster recovery in our modern world today. You know, those of us that have been around Veeam for a long time, we kind of got it baked in our head. This is how not only backup works, but more importantly, the recovery works and how you plan for that and all the steps of the way. And, you know, I still personally, I don't know about you guys, but I still think about object storage as quote unquote, that new thing in Veeam, although it's been around now in some versions for like 3-4 years and in the modern form for 2 years. So now is definitely the time to really look at how you can enhance your disaster recovery strategy with this technology. So to start with, I always kind of like to think about the why. Okay, so today when we, you know, when I first started using Veeam, what did we want to solve for? We wanted to solve for the fire, flood, and blood. You know, if the building's going to burn down, it's going to be on fire, be flooded. How do we get our systems back up? That's not necessarily the case as the leading factor today. Today, it's all about ransomware and cybersecurity issues. And so, you know, if you look at this slide, I love this one a lot. Mostly, you know, one of the other Vanguard community members actually runs this website that creates this data. And it's just astronomical, the amount that every year, the amount of ransomware attacks that occur happen. Went from a little over 2,000 last year, and this number is actually out of date. I pulled the slide in October, and it's, you know, and even at that point where we were up almost a third over the previous year.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too that, you know, the majority of this pie graph is, you know, US based companies that are getting hit with ransomware. In your opinion, Jim, why do you think that that's so? Do you have any idea or any clue?
You know, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just opportunity. I mean, it's the same reason why you always hear so much more about malware and ransomware and security attacks against, say, Windows servers versus, say, Mac OS. There's a lot more of them, and so therefore it becomes an issue. So, but it's not just the US. I mean, while 60% are here, this is truly a global problem. I mean, you know, 1111 is a global organization. We're working with customers around the world quite a bit to deal with those situations and to deal with those scenarios for themselves. And, you know, if we can go on to the next slide, you know, so as we think about how ransomware affects our DR strategy, we have to solve for a number of things that are quote unquote new. The first one is data encryption, which this is the, you know, the ransomware screen that everybody's seen. Enter your Bitcoin and go pay the ransom so you can try to decrypt the things. What's just as impactful today is exfiltration, where they take a copy of your data, hold that, and try to use that as a secondary ransom. To make those that first thing happen, a lot of times one of the things they're targeting is actually deleting your backups and your replicas. And so that's really what we're talking about today. Of these 4 things, are the last 2 on this list: the backup, deletion, and then dealing with the complexity of service restore. You know, you've got to be. It's not that you've got backups. Backups are great. Backups that you can't restore in a meaningful way. Still great, but you kind of got to know what you're doing with them. So moving on, let's look and see what this actually has to do with your DR strategy. Okay, and you'll have to forgive me the little click through. So with object storage, there's a number of reasons why you want to involve it. So we talked about that backup deletion. And if you've been around Veeam for more than, say, I don't know what, Kirsten, 5 minutes, you've probably heard immutability the same way that Jan heard Marcia, as I date myself to Brady Bunch references. So immutability is absolute key. That capability to say that once a backup is written, it cannot be deleted in a way that cannot be resurrected. okay, and you've got it broken out. The second thing we have to solve for, as our data sets are growing, our workloads are growing, and they're going everywhere now. It's not just the data center, it's the file server, it's the cloud, it's everywhere. You've got to have cloud level scalability to allow for cloud level data protection, cloud level workloads, excuse me. And then we want that data to be durable. When we talk about object storage, there are different flavors that always come into play. When we look at it, or when I look at it, the ones that are kind of the gold standards are the ones that have multiple copies of each bit of data, or every object that's written. It's eventual. I'm going to write a data to say US East 1 in AWS, and it's going to land into one region, but eventually each of those objects is going to get copied to at least one of the other two regions as well. So if something happens to one of those regions, that data can still be put back together again. And finally, most of us work for businesses in some way, shape, or form where money doesn't literally grow on trees. So we always have to take cost into a factor.
Yeah.
How have you seen it, Kirsten?
Yeah, I think this slide's really nice because when you think about, setting up immutability, there are some different ways that you can set it up. Maybe you want to use like a Linux side immutability, but with object storage, it really makes it easier to, make sure you're utilizing that functionality within like AWS or Azure to make sure that you're keeping those backups safe. And then also, like what you mentioned with like scalability, today's businesses are continuously operating, and customers and employees expect their applications to be available when they need to. With all this data being, generated and need it to be available all the time, object storage being able to store that data is really going to make sure that you're meeting all the types of retention requirements that you might need. Maybe you need to store data for longer periods of time, but you don't want to make that investment on premises. Object storage makes that a little bit easier as well. So I think that this slide is really good to use because object storage can solve a lot of the problems that you had on the previous slide. Maybe it was the slide before this or the slide before that one. I only can see one slide here, but yeah. But for those people in the audience, like maybe this is somebody that is completely new to tech. How would you you were talking about why use object storage, but what is it exactly? How would you describe it in maybe like layman's terms?
Yeah, so the kind of halfway joke that I always say about object storage is a database that identifies the file system. Essentially is what it boils down to. When you get down to the roots of what an object storage system is, and it doesn't really matter who we're talking about, which vendor, which open source project, of which there's many of all of those. Essentially, it's going to be some kind of database, distributed database application that can run across one or many servers. And then within that database application, you essentially have this concept of key pairs, okay? So think of a bucket as a table in a database. If you look at it as a file system, it's going to feel kind of like a folder. And then that entire, how do I get to where an actual object is written, is what's called the prefix. And then the actual data, the object that we talk about, is called a key. Okay, so again, if you guys have ever worked with a DBA or worked with SQL or something like that, you're probably hearing a lot of terms that you've already heard before, but we're taking those same things and we're putting it into a file system. So one of the things that makes it nice and scalable, I don't know if Kirsten or Sophia, if you guys have run into this, but I know I've constantly in my life had to chase, oh my goodness, the backup file server, the file server I'm using for my repository is full. How am I going to scale this thing out? And while Sober is nice, it's far better to have a scalable file system that I just rack and stack another box and it automatically absorbs itself in, or leverage cloud services like AWS, 1111 Zone OBS, or other services that are out there that you just don't care. You just keep writing data as much as you want and it just works. Now, there are some gotchas that you want to consider when it comes to object storage. It's not, they're not showstoppers by any means, but you want to design around them and make sure that you're doing things in an efficient way. The biggest one is all around the cost structure. As we listed on the previous screen, cost is a deciding factor when it comes to I'm going to use object storage. Well, for some providers, it's an all-in cost, especially as we look at what in Veeam speak, you'll hear S3 compatible a lot. And these are going to be your service providers, kind of like I said, 1111's object storage service that's based on a Ceph project. Wasabi's out there, a lot of those. And while there are some guardrails and top levels you have to be concerned with, by and large, what you want to think about is, are those fees included for if I'm going to have to pull that data back out? Like I've got to do a restore, I want to do file actions with it, I want to do things like threat hunter, things like that. Or am I going to manage those efficiently? There's also the concept of API calls. This is a very real cloud reality today. Those API hits that you make to the people that are providing that service actually does cost them money because they have to run the infrastructure that can keep all those calls continuing to be handled. And again, sometimes these are taken care of. Sometimes you have to be aware of them. AWS famously directly, that's a concern that you have to deal with. And then many providers will put on what's called minimum retention. The most common ones you see are 30 or 90 days, that when I write an object, okay, the expectation from that service provider is that it's going to sit there for 30, 60, 90 days minimum, because every time we do an operation, that becomes quote unquote expensive against that data. And while it's good, it's really good for data protection because we don't typically want to keep backups for just a minute. We want to keep them for 30, 60, 90 days. So we can deal with that easily. And then finally, we talk about classes of object storage. And Kirsten, I don't know if you've looked into this, but especially as we get into any of the major cloud-based providers, they all have different classifications of how object storage works. And really those just deal with how are we going to optimize the cost structure versus the capabilities of that storage.
Yeah, when you say like minimum retention, so depending on, the different, I guess, classes that you would choose to store your data in, are there different minimum retention settings for each class?
Yeah, that's very true. So let's use AWS as an example, because AWS actually created the S3 protocol. So a lot of everybody else's work is derivative of what they do. So for example, S3 standard has no minimum retention. If I go through and I create an object and then I delete it 30 minutes later or even the next day, there's not going to be any penalty in my bill that says I deleted this thing early. Mm-hmm. If, for example, you use S3 infrequent access, the standard infrequent access, which is the same performance-based capability, but they've optimized it to make it cheaper, but based on the idea that you're going to write far more than you read, then that data has to be there for 30 days minimum. Okay, if you delete it after a day, then you're still going to pay for that object for that full 30 days. Okay, and as you go down the AWS S3 rabbit hole all the way down into Glacier, those minimum retentions can change here, there, and throughout. Like I said, it's not just an AWS thing. There are other providers that do this as well. And then finally, on performance, on considerations, is we have some performance things that we have to think about. If we're doing this on-prem, there are different providers that can do on-premises deployments. Some are more performant than others. Some are more optimized for different types of workloads. You just have to do your own homework, the same way you would with a primary storage array. And then in the cloud, we've been talking about the variations there. And then finally, think about there are performance concerns around immutability, mostly around, how does that work with API calls? How does that work with your call structure? And how does that work with the performance of how you're going to do this on the back end? There's a great help center document. If you just search for Veeam block generation, you can learn all about this and more than you probably ever want to know. And it's a really great document to think about it. So now we've talked about the goods and the bads, let's look how we're actually going to use this. Okay, so this is just a sample slide that I always kind of use for how can I put the object storage into my backup strategy. Okay, so if we think about a typical Veeam deployment, if I've got a VBR server that's backing up VMware-based workloads, okay, and then we have a file share out there, probably, not the name drop, but like a NetApp filer sitting in the corner that's just providing file shares to all of my employees, okay? Three things to cover off here is I am a massive proponent and big fan of the configuration backup that you always have that you typically should have on your VBR server. Write that in an encrypted form out to an immutable bucket directly. Just write it straight out to an object storage bucket somewhere in the cloud that you can get to it. That makes sure that your configuration can't be deleted. Make sure that it's encrypted so that you can get these things back, because we have to think about what happens. Why am I going to have to use this? Okay, if something's happened ransomware-wise to your infrastructure, there is a good chance that may have happened to your backup server as well, and you're going to actually have to recover that backup server in the process of it. So just having that out there is a good first step. Next, we're going to think about how are we going to land backups. Okay, we still want to land those things locally. Okay, that local repository can be object storage. We've talked about that. There's lots of vendors that can work with that. It can be the shiny new Veeam hardened repository ISO that dropped, was it yesterday, Kirsten?
Yeah, I think it did, didn't it? I know we had a lot of stuff released yesterday, so.
Yeah. And so as long as you've got something secure, but then we can get into cloud object storage for that backup copy. Literally that secondary copy you're going to have off-site for if you need to recover back, whether your repo is not, something's physically happened to your repository, or for whatever reason on-prem. And then you can also use it to extend the life, the capacity of that local repo by doing sober in move mode, and put those long-term archives out into an archive tier object storage. And then finally, the last use case that, I don't think I'm unique in this, but I always like to advocate for, is that, so often I hear about, we've got a big, multi-petabyte file system array sitting out there that just serves files out for my customers, or maybe it has a document retention system or things like that. And the option is many times just have a second one of them and you replicate it. Well, that's got its own challenges. For file shares, we can back those up with Veeam and just send them directly out to scalable object storage. So we don't have to deal with, I've got 5 petabytes of source data. Now I need 5 petabytes of backup data. That can be much cheaper. It can be in object storage. Does that make sense to you, Kirsten?
Yeah, I think I really always enjoy slides that, kind of diagram the whole infrastructure out, so you get a real clear understanding of, how to set everything up. And like you mentioned too, considering, like, if you're not doing this already, putting that configuration backup in an object storage bucket is going to make it a lot easier when that disaster happens and it wipes out everything you got going on, because you might have to spin up a new Veeam backup server, and if you don't have that configuration backup, you're kind of like starting from scratch. You're going to be really, digging in, trying to figure out where, how to recover, right? So having that in the cloud to make it a lot easier when that disaster happens to start recovering is really going to be beneficial to make sure that you're really maintaining business continuity.
Yep. So we talked about before that backup's important, but the recovery part's just as important, as not more. One thing to think about as you and your organization are getting into your hybrid cloud journey is now we've got these backups and we've got them out in the cloud. We've put them out there already with our secondary thing. So one thing you can consider is having a managed recovery product or capability where we actually recover that data out to the cloud or into another data center that you don't own. So I've got a sample example recovery scenario here where I just recover all of it right out to AWS. I'm working with the idea that I've used AWS S3 as my object storage. I can go run me a VBR server directly in a VPC, restore my configuration backup to it, restore any databases I want either directly out to an EC2 instance or actually to the RDS service. Just restore the databases and have it as a managed service. File servers can go out to FSX or EFS as needed, and that's all a good capability. Does that make sense, Kirsten?
Yeah. I think that we're probably getting ready for our
Yeah.
demo, right? So, sorry for that quick turnaround, but I'm excited for a demo. I always love seeing the product in action. So, talk us through what you're showing us, Jim.
Yeah, so real quick in a demo, let's take a look at, if you are new to object storage, kind of how these things get used. So we're going to go into backup repositories the same way we've always done with Veeam, okay? And once you tell it to go through and do an object storage repository, you'll have a number of options that are out there. You can do a variety of options, and under hyperscaler, so we've been doing S3 as our examples for things. And once you get into it, it's just like any other repository. But if we look at one of these things, we talked earlier, Kirsten, about classes.
Yeah.
Veeam is to a best practices sense class aware. So as I go through and create this repository for AWS S3, I can uncheck this box, and now it's going to use S3 standard. And S3 standard's great. It'll let you do everything, but it's going to do it in the most expensive format of that possible. So if I check infrequent access, I can leverage those things. And you can even put that down to a single availability zone, which is even cheaper, but I don't recommend that one as much these days. The other thing you'll notice that I've done here is turning on immutability is just as simple as checking a box. This is a repository I've already created. So you can see I can reconfigure the days, but I can't turn immutability off. And so once I get out of this, okay.
So have you seen a lot of your customers wanting to use, standard class, or are they always infrequent access?
Yeah, we very much so advocate to our customers that infrequent access, especially with 11.11, because we are an AWS partner. We sell it. We've done some special things around that classification through our contract, not to go salesman mode, but we've got some things that make that a little better. So we advocate for infrequent access. It really just comes down to what your use case is and how you want to interact with that. But as we look at how we actually, sorry, Kirsten.
Oh, I was going to ask this another question about immutability settings. So oftentimes I get questions out when I'm talking to customers about, how long should I set my immutability period? Do you have a best practice that you use as for that, is to trying to figure out which is the best fit for each business?
Well, I have it. So it really depends on what your business outcomes are. Different companies have different requirements, and a lot of it's going to come from your legal team. So your first step is talk to your legal team and see what your retention needs to be. But by and large, know that in modern VBR, you've got between 1 and 90 days that you can set for your core retention when you use object storage with immutability. But the bigger part of it is you always have to do some GFS, and I will say that you want to use GFS restore points as much as possible, because the more that you use that, the more efficient that is going to become. So, typically I like to do 30 days for myself as core retention, and then I'll do 3 months worth of weeklies, 6 to 12 months of monthlies, and then a couple yearlies as well. The reality of object storage is you very much so get access to that zero block cloning that Veeam's talked about for years, but you actually get to see it with object. So oftentimes when we layer in GFS, what you'll see is like a 40% reduction overall in what your actual data usage is versus what you're protecting, because a lot of that is quote unquote free. Okay. So like I said, I think we're coming right up to the end of time here, aren't we? So
Just
like
about.
I said, just real quick. So we've got configuration, and it's just a matter of putting it in. When you do write to the cloud, please do always turn on encryption. I can keep that data from being deleted, but I can't keep somebody from reading it if you don't turn on encryption. So please do that. And with that, we can pretty much wrap it up.
Awesome. Thanks for that short demo. I'm sorry I was asking so many questions.
No.
I'm just so curious, right?
That's okay. It's a fun topic. I'm a fan of it. So
yeah. Well, with the limited time, I know there's so much more to share. Jim, where can people find out more about the work that you are doing with this? Do you have a blog? Should they just like slide into the DMs on LinkedIn? How can people find out more?
So all of the above. My personal blog is Cooley.info. I will tell you, you know, he said 1111, we're doing a lot of work with it. So please, it's worth going to 1111systems.com and take a look and see what their object storage offerings are there. And yeah, by all means, slide into my DMs. I'm pretty much all the social places that the nerds collaborate at. So find me wherever.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, Kirsten, for joining us today. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this is a monthly show, so this is the last one for 2024, but I think we ended it off on a good note, I think everyone can say. A big thank you for engaging throughout the year. If you want to stay in tune with the community till 2025, you can always join us on the Veeam Community Hub, community.veeam.com. And I hope you all have a great rest of your year, holidays, whatever you celebrate. Hope it's full of friends, family, and of course, community. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.